Hello, and welcome back to this tutorial series for the Eternal Lands map editor. Last time I said we'd do both particles and lighting this time, but I'll just be covering particles and save lighting for the next time. In this video, I'll show you all of the most common uses of particles, both in the client and the editor, to see how they're set up. This video will be different than previous ones where I spent the whole time showing the tutorial map we've been going through in previous videos. Instead, I'll focus more on what's already in use on the maps in the game, and for a few of them I'll do a step-by-step showing how to create some things like campfires, lit candles, and torches. First, I created a junk map and set a bunch of different particles up to give you an idea of what's available. For example, these right here are particles to improve the look of lava. Removing the lava tiling, you can see them better. As you can see, there are many options with various sizes and behaviors. However, only a handful of these are regularly used on maps. The rest are rare cases or even never used. In the map editor, the particle is represented by a small dark cube, which you can see several of on the screen. It's with this that you move the particle and place it properly. Some have a larger cube directly above them. Those cubes are lights, and they're attached to the particle. These are on things such as fire, which by default is a source of light. Unlike the lights we'll cover in the next tutorial, you cannot adjust lights that are attached to particles. You will still need to keep them in mind as a source of light when you're setting up lighting on your own map, though. Most particles don't have lights, as you can see. For this tutorial, we'll only be looking at the most common particles. You're free to use any of the available particles, but always make sure that they actually fit in with your map design. Fire, in its many ways of being used, is the most commonly used particles. Here we're going to look at a lit campfire. This one is one I created near the center of North Zirakgunda. This is not a lightable fire, but one that is already lit. It cannot be used for cooking meat. On those, you will not use particles yourself, as the server has to handle them, and they're set up in a special way that we won't be covering here. Here is the same campfire as seen in the map editor. When looking at these examples, take a good note of the placement of the particle square relative to what it is supposed to be attached to. Hiding the 3D objects, you can see that this particle is placed just beneath the wood that is supposed to be lit. The attached light floats above it. And there are, of course, no height tiles in the fire pit, as firewalking is not yet a skill in the game. Note that particles look quite different in the editor than they do in the client. The editor version is much less detailed and usually just enough shown to help with placement. You may need to repeatedly test particle placement in the game client to make sure they're placed correctly, as they're not all very intuitive. Going back to the tutorial map we've been looking at in previous videos, let's do a step-by-step setup of a lit fire on the beach, with the placement of the particle done just like was done in the North Zirakgunda fire pit we just saw. Pressing Ctrl B to open the 3D objects, we'll look under Trees and Plants to find the subsection Firewood and Logs. In here, we'll select the first Firewood option. This is the most common for outdoor fires. The second one is better used in houses inside the fireplace. The firewood takes up a 3x3 square area, so rotate and place it as best as possible in a 3x3 area using the grid. This looks good, so let's switch to particles and open the list of particle files. Like the 2D objects, there's no images to see what each is, so you may want to experiment to see what they all look like. Mostly just remember the ones used here and you'll be good for most situations. For an outdoor fire, the Fire Big particle object is the best choice. Select it, and then, like the fire we saw in North Gunda, we'll move it so it is just below the center of the firewood. Get it in place height-wise first, and then look at it from above to make sure it is centered on the wood. And as always, Adjust your height tiling to make sure players won't be walking through the fire pit by removing the height tiling on the 3x3 area taken up by the wood. Also, as always, regularly save your work. That was simple enough. You can also see examples of pre-lit fires elsewhere throughout the maps, including, for example, in Eidolaron at the 4 houses on the south side of the ship docks. Another way particles are used is to create waterfalls. We'll just be looking at how these are set up, not actually making one. This one is located in the center of the north end of Aethelfon and acts as one of the entrances to Wormgoth Cave using a cave object behind the water particles. Besides the long blue watery particles, there's some splashing type white particles at the bottom. And here in the map editor, you can get a better idea of how it is set up. The blue water actually consists of 6 different particle objects, with a few others at the bottom for added decor. Here I'm moving one of the blue water objects to the side so you can better see what an individual one looks like without the others. And we'll take a quick look at the added decor at the bottom. This one is hard to see as it lies flat across the water, adding just some minor particles to add to the water movement. We can't even see it over the dirt, but moving it back to the water, you can see the slight addition it provides to the overall design. There's a couple of these. And finally, there's these ones that provide a white splashing effect. They're actually more designed for water fountains, which you'll see later. Another waterfall is on the same map, but inside Smuggler's Cave. Here I had to make up a design that made use of these 2 cave entrances out on the water of AA. So I made one player usable, and the other allowed water into Smuggler's Cave in the form of a waterfall. Here in the map editor, you can see that it is similarly set up like the one we just looked at, with several blue water particle objects. As I knew this map would be primarily only used for invasions, I limited the design of it, not adding particles at the bottom like the previous waterfall, to reduce possible GRU issues for players. And a little cheat, you can see sand here at the top of the water particles that is actually blue when it's seen in the client. It's actually sand that I set to a blue color to give the best possible impression of water with the limitations of EL. You'll see how to set up colors of objects in the next video. Going back to fire, we're now going to look at torches. These can be seen in many caves, such as Dross Inn, and places like this, Vermore Castle in Whitestone. Several torches act as the lighting for large parts of this castle. A closer look shows that torches tend to be made up of 3 parts: the torch, fire particle, the wood torch, and its metal holder. In the map editor, we can better see these parts. Note as always the positioning of the particle square, which covers up the top of the wood torch object, with its accompanying light above it. This light is darker than the one we saw with the fire we made earlier on the tutorial map, as it doesn't provide as strong of a light as Huge Campfire does. It may seem odd to have the wood torch and its holder as separate objects as they are normally used, as seen here, but both objects can be used in other ways, especially the metal holder, which can, for example, be used to hang swords along a wall. Let's go back to the tutorial map, and this time we're going to set up a torch, attaching it to the wall that was added last time. You'll find both the torch and its holder in Lights, Decorations, Miscellaneous, in the subsection Lanterns and Torches. Always start with the metal holder since it will determine the placement. Find a nice height for it on the wall, around the average head height of an elf or a similar player. Depending on the map's layout, where you're placing one, you may want to ensure it is over its own grid tile so you can make it unwalkable. This will keep players' hair from catching on fire. Tweak the positioning to be as best as possible before doing anything else, as moving this will mean moving everything else after it. Next, we'll pull out the wooden torch and adjust its height and location so it appears to be fitting inside the holder. Make sure to look at it from multiple angles, as what looks great in one direction can be very off from another. For these, the metal ring should fit around the wood solidly. And this looks good. So let's switch to particles and open the particle list. What we want here is called Fire Torch in the particle list. Move it up and place the particle square as it was on the ones in Vermar Castle, covering the top of the wood of the torch centered as best as possible. It's not really feasible to look at this from a top-down view, so it'll take a bit more tweaking than the campfire did. This can take a bit of trial and error getting it placed as best as possible. But you want to get it as centered as you possibly can. I'm seeing here that the square won't fully cover the wood, so having the wood slightly sticking out on the front and side of the particle square seems to be the way to go. And of course, saving our work. And that's it. Looking at it from a top view, we see this torch is already above a non-walkable location, so no height tile adjusting is needed at this time. Next, let's look at some generic particles that can be seen in some special areas. For an example, we'll head back to North Zerock Gunda, where I created a fast regeneration pool in the center of the main living area of Gunda. The particles you're seeing here are a single particle object that is flat, and it covers a 6x6 height tile area, which is the size of the water that you see here. Water doesn't sparkle like that on its own, but I placed the particles to indicate that it was a special location where you'd heal faster. It looks a lot different in the map editor, as I did a lot of special color and blending on the 3D objects to give it the look that it has. But hiding the 3D objects, as well as hiding the water ground tiling, you see the particle square is actually more in a corner than it is in the center, as the particles are not directly centered on the square itself. The particles also don't cover the full 6x6 height tile area that they do in the client itself. Things like this will need trial and error as well as testing in the client to ensure they get placed properly. I had to place this one several times before I finally got it right. Next, let's look at another common fire use, and that is candles. You can find candles lit in many places throughout the maps, but I'll use this example of a location that won't be available until 1.9.6 client is released. This will be a cathedral in Eidolaron, replacing a few buildings in the northwest area inside the city walls. I got the idea of this multi-height table with a bunch of lit candles from real-life cathedrals. It took a bit of work to get this many candles and their particles placed perfectly. And a quick peek at the rest of the cathedral to give you a reference to the design. As you can see, there's even a few torches in here. Going into the map editor, you see it's difficult to even know there's candles there with so many particle squares covering them up. Placing particles on candles is a lot simpler than lighting the torches, as there's a simple trick to it. And that is this: if you look closely, you can see the very tip of each candle wick is showing as a black spot on the top of each particle square. The trick to placing these correctly is to use an overhead view and move the particle centered up and down until it shows just 1 pixel of the wick above the particle square. This gives the perfect way to properly center it, and you know the height is good every time. All of these candles are at different heights, but all particles were placed easily using this trick. Candles are normally an inside object, but just for an example, we'll set one up outside here on our tutorial map among the barrels outside the house. Again, in the lights, decoration, miscellaneous, we'll go into the subsection of candles. Let's put a stand up first to place the candle on. Then select a candle. Any of the three available will work for this. You'll want to move the candle up until it is at a height where it is sitting on the stand, and then use an overhead view to center it on the stand. That was simple enough. Now let's light it up with a particle. For this, we want the particle named Candle Flame. And we'll place it the same way I described before. Move the particle up and down until you get just 1 pixel of the candle's wick showing above the particle square. Then center the square on top of the wick. And save your work. Simple and easy. Note that candle flames don't have an attached light, as they don't produce enough light that would be of any use at a distance. Our next useful particle is chimney smoke. Here in Tarzangard is a good example, as several buildings, including storage, have smoke coming from their chimneys. This is not something to put on every chimney, of course, just on ones that are lit inside. Or in the case of storage here, the fireplace wood can be lit for cooking food, so that's good enough. The smoke on this map is not quite placed properly though, as can be more readily seen in the map editor. This is an old map, and the map creators back then didn't have the hindsight that I have today, so some mistakes on older maps can be expected. You can see the particle square isn't even lined up with the chimney on the right. It's not that noticeable though. For chimney smoke, the placement is actually quite simple. You just place the particle square only slightly above and centered on the chimney. There's no real trick to it. Let's assume our house on the tutorial map has a fire going inside and get some smoke showing. In the particles, we want the Smoke Big particle. Select it, move it up so it just starts to show above the chimney, and then make sure it's centered on the chimney. The height of this particular particle doesn't have to be precise, just in the general area of the top of the chimney. And there you have it, one of the simpler ones to use. Sadly, the simplest one is also the least seen, since players aren't normally looking above the buildings. As always, don't forget to save your work. Where there's fire, there's now been smoke, but now let's go back to another water usage. Water fountains can be seen like this in several places. Palan Vertos near the honeycomb, for example. But this example is from a map that will be in the 1.9.6 release. Here we have a pool of water with a fountain in the center, water spraying up from the middle. You saw this particular particle in the waterfall on AA that hid the Wormgoth cave entrance, being used as splashing. Here is its proper use as a water fountain. In the map editor, the coloring here looks odd because of special lighting that I've used, but ignore that. In the fountain itself, you can see the particle square sits just slightly below the very tip of the fountain. The placement is very simple in this case, but of course testing was needed to get used to placing it initially. There are more common particles used that you don't have control over necessarily that you should be aware of. For example, at night, lighting fixtures have little bug-like particles around them. These are a part of the light objects themselves, and you cannot change these. At the top of the particle list is a couple named bag in and bag out. These cannot be used on the maps as they don't last long enough. They're specialized, and you can see them when you drop and pick up bags. Other particles you may be used to seeing include those long beams of light at portal locations, such as in Whitestone or the portal rooms. Those you actually have control to turn on and off, and may even use them in non-portal ways, though it's not recommended as it would be confusing to players. We'll look at those more when we cover creating def files for maps. These large particle beams are what I'm referring to, of course. Other particles can be seen when doing things like teleporting. Here you see particles in action using teleport to range magic. That's it for now. Next time, we'll start lighting the maps.